Right, today we're going to be looking at Mintzberg's paper from 1985, which is called Of Strategies Deliberate and Emergent. It was published in the Strategic Management Journal in 1985. So what it's looking at is the distinction between strategies that are planned or deliberate and strategies that, well, aren't, those that sort of emerge. And Mintzberg and Waters put a framework together of how strategies are different from those that up until then had been conceived as planned and deliberate. So if you look at the abstract for the paper, it's deliberate and emergent strategies may be conceived as two ends of a continuum along which real-world strategies lie. This paper seeks to develop this notion and some basic issues related to strategic choice by elaborating along this continuum various types of strategies uncovered in research. These include strategies labelled planned, entrepreneurial, ideological, umbrella, process, unconnected, consensus, and imposed. So, so strategies can be either deliberate or emergent or something in between. So Mintzberg looks from some work he did in beginning of the 80s and indeed carrying on some of his work he did in the 1970s of how firms actually carry out their strategies. So strategy is conceived in terms of what the leaders of an organisation plan to do in the future. Strategy is treated as an analytic process for establishing long-range goals and action plans. So this is what Mintzberg is sort of criticising, in that strategy up until that time had always been considered planned. They investigate the relationship between the leadership plans and intentions and what organisations actually did. So this is really carrying on Mintzberg's work with previous work where he looked at what managers do. This is what strategies are. So looking at the path between what's intended in the strategy and what's realised. So the idea is that strategy is, there is a strategy for almost all firms. It's very unusual to get a firm with no strategy at all. But we're looking at that path between what kind of should have happened if you were carrying out a planned strategy and what did happen, the strategy that was realised. So Mintzberg's defining deliberate strategies, those that are realised as intended, and strategies that are emergent, to contrast that, are strategies, are patterns or consistencies realised despite or in the absence of intentions. So that sounds all a bit theoretical. So it's kind of easier to look at this diagram, which is Mintzberg's kind of main contribution. He does some other sort of vignettes of individual strategies, but this is the kind of the takeaway point of his paper, or their paper. So the first is what you'd see from most strategic planning books in the 1960s and 70s. That top line there, deliberate strategy. Strategies go from what you intend to happen to what's realised. That's what happens. That is strategy. That is planning. Before we talked about strategic management, we talked about strategic planning. So this is really the traditional role of strategy. And what Mintzberg's saying is that's fine if it happens, but a lot of the time that doesn't happen. So firms will have a strategy that they intend to carry out, but doesn't actually take place. So what he calls that an unrealised strategy. So, you can think of that as strategic failure, or you can actually say, well, it's not necessarily a failure, because what comes and replaces that is an emergent strategy. So strategy is really created somewhere else rather than the strategic planning cycle. And so the emergent strategy becomes the realised strategy and the firm carries on. So this is their sort of main contribution. So, but apart from that, Mintzberg's looking at these sort of two extremes. So he talks about deliberate and pure strategies. These are these ones here. But actually, there are a lot of ones in between. So he classifies them as planned strategy, entrepreneurial, ideological, umbrella, process, connected, and consensus strategies, and imposed strategy. So the idea is that these are somewhere in between the pure deliberate and pure emergent strategy. So pure deliberate and pure emergent strategies. So if you think about what a pure deliberate strategy is, it requires precise intentions. Everybody in the organisation, these are the actors he talks about, need to carry out the strategy exactly as intended. No external forces can sort of change what's planned. And if you think about real organisations, that doesn't happen because strategy isn't carried out in a vacuum. There are always external processes and or external factors that kind of upset a planned strategy. So an entirely deliberate strategy is Mintzberg would say, very rare, or a tall order. Whereas a perfect emergent strategy requires consistency and action over time in the absence of intention. So the idea is you do something and in no way did you intend it to happen. And that's really kind of difficult to think, difficult to imagine action in the total absence of intention, as they say. So purely deliberate and emergent strategies are these sort of extreme views on that continuum, along which we expect that actually what really happens, real world strategies to fall. So they're on those extremes. So the first one that they talk about is a planned strategy, where you have clear articulated intentions backed up by formal controls, formal planning perhaps, an environment that's acquiescent. So the environment doesn't really change that much. So as a result, your planned strategy is more likely to actually be successful. You do articulate what your strategic intent is, or your strategic plans are. You do write them down. So planned strategies are found in very stable environments, or predictable or benign or controllable environments. So for example, ones that require lots of capital investment, mining companies, airlines. Well, airlines under regulation, fighting wars tends to be a good thing if you've got some idea of a plan. And bureaucracies tend to act very well in terms of planned strategies. Entrepreneurial strategy, on the other hand, is really the consistency doesn't come from the plan itself. It comes from the person who's really responsible for that plan. So the entrepreneur. So these are companies where you have an individual who's planning, or at least has some idea of what the strategy is, and they can sort of adapt their strategy over time. So because they have that control over the organisation. This tends to be rather small new firms, but can exist where firms become larger, or can be established when you have an environment which is creates a crisis, and you have to sort of rally around a individual, a leader. So entrepreneurial strategies can happen in larger firms too. So the entrepreneur is really setting not a detailed plan, but is setting their general sense of direction, but allows for this sort of adaptation, for changes to take place if things come up, if the environment changes, or to take advantage of new opportunities. So individuals learn, but firms who act through hierarchies, because everything takes just so long, that doesn't necessarily happen very well. So entrepreneurial strategies are good for small firms, good for individually focused firms, but don't work so well in hierarchies, and that's one of the problems of bureaucratic organisations. But you can start with an entrepreneurial strategy, and that can be used as a basis for planning. So ideological strategies are ones where the members of the organisation actually have a shared vision or an ideology. So they sort of know what's meant to happen because their indoctrination into the ideology. And it may be something that's articulated in terms of, ideological, maybe a religious organisation, or maybe an organisation that has some sort of inspirational charter, if you like, to describe what individuals should be doing, or to always guide the behaviour of the individuals. You can call this a credo in organisations. So you sort of know what you should be doing within the firm. So these intentions are sort of rough visions, and they can be adapted and changed, but the idea is that change can be quite difficult to do because it requires the change to happen throughout the organisation, change the ideology, which requires the change in the collective mind, which is kind of difficult to do. And there can be very much resistance to change. Perhaps it may be because it's harking back to times for the founder or the creator or the person who's revered within the organisation. But this tends to be on the sort of deliberate end of the continuum between deliberate and emergent. The umbrella strategy is where individuals may have partial control of the organisation. So the idea is you set a boundary, or what Mintzberg would call an umbrella, under which actions are expected to fall. So strategies are allowed to emerge, but you can't be too kind of outside that umbrella. It has to be constrained within the umbrella. So it allows emergent strategy, but as long as they are kind of not too emergent. they have to be within those constraints of what's acceptable within the organisation. Mintzberg calls this a deliberately emergent strategy, one where the leadership encourages emergent strategies, but within these boundaries. So, for example, professional services firms, they may set out the vision of the organisation, set the general goals and intentions, but essentially, as long as you don't do something too crazy, you're going to be it's going to be fine. Process strategies is where actors or individuals within the firms have the discretion to determine the outcomes, just because the environment in which they're playing is too complex or uncontrollable. So there's this separation of the process of strategy making and the content of strategy making. So this tends to be organizations that are conglomerates or have a headquarters or corporate headquarters, which is very much process driven, but underneath there the divisional managers or the business unit managers are allowed to develop their own strategies. So the content of the strategy is if you like, delegated to the divisional managers, but the process of controlling that strategy is maintained by the corporate headquarters or the corporate strategy. Unconnected strategy. So this is where you've got a main strategy that takes place in the organisation, but you've got a subunit which is doing its own thing. So you may have autonomy, either deliberately created or just because you've got individual experts that are allowed to do their own thing. So if you think about hospitals, consultants within hospitals may be allowed to set up their own practices, or within universities you may get professors who are allowed to do their own thing. And the individual strategies of those individuals may be either deliberate or emergent. It doesn't really matter, but it's really saying that the organisation allows or has allowed the autonomy for individuals within that organisation. You may get sort of clandestine strategies, which are perhaps not really known about because they're not really articulated to the corporate headquarters or the centre, which can potentially cause problems. A consensus strategy, on the other hand, is where kind of everybody thinks the same, not necessarily because it's imposed, for example, because of the ideology. It's just because everyone's come to that same consensus. So over time, everyone sort of has agreed what the strategy should be. The strategy has evolved over time. So it's delivered by collective action and discussion throughout the organisation, rather than a collective intent. So it's very different from those ideological strategies. An imposed strategy, however, is one that's been imposed from outside, either from a majority stakeholder or a majority shareholder, or by the environment. So there may be just a change that happens where you've been told what to do. You may have a corporate restructuring, or a competitor may have come into or gone out of the market. And so essentially it's driven from the environment rather than from the individual. So this one is sort of a bit different from the others, that it's imposed on the organisation rather than being created within the organisation. So the environment is therefore the driver of strategy. So they were the strategies that were explored by Mintzberg and Waters' paper. So once again, in this continuum or this range between pure deliberate and pure emergent strategy. So they're all kind of created from within the organisation, from the actors or individuals within the organisation, apart from that imposed strategy, which is derived from the environment. And finally, Mintzberg and Waters talk about, actually that's all fine, but can you actually do anything to learn? So it's fine to have an emergent strategy. You shouldn't just say that because you don't have a realised strategy that was intended, that's a failure. But what can you do with this emergent strategy? You can carry it out, but actually what you need to do in order to learn from that is to sort of have this feedback that your realised strategy then is imposed into your intended strategy. So it's not really saying that emergent strategy is better than a planned strategy. It's more to say that actually organisations should take the results of that realised strategy and really feed it back into their planning or strategic decision making, just so that benefit or that learning about the environment hasn't been lost, and then perhaps you can then take your intended strategy and that becomes a realised strategy. So the main contribution of Mintzberg's paper was to say actually strategy isn't always planned. Strategic plans that do fail, that intended strategies that are unrealised, are not actually failures, they're just unrealised. And as long as your emergent strategy takes its place, it can in fact be a better strategy. So Mintzberg is not really saying one is better than the other, but he is saying, or they are saying, that organisations should be able to take the results of an emergent strategy and feed that back into their planning or strategic cycle.